The driver, a man in his 40s, bloody and gagging, looked at me with his eyes. His chest barely rose when he whispered, "Tell Alice that I forgive her, and that Leela deserves the truth." I froze. Alice. My Alice. And Leela, my daughter. I leaned in closer, trying to make him say more, but his eyes turned glassy, and his head slumped to the side. He was gone. For a second, I couldn't move. My gloved hand was still gripping the edge of the shattered car door. The flicker of flames nearby and the distant sound of sirens barely registered. The only thing I could hear were his words, playing on repeat in my head. Someone called my name. Reilly. We need help over here. I blinked and turned toward the voice. My team was still working, hoses blasting water, medics tending to someone on the pavement, radios crackling with updates. But I couldn't move. I stared at the lifeless man in the driver's seat. Blood was still dripping from a gash on his forehead, soaking into his collar. Who was he? How did he know Alice? Why did he say her name? And Leela, what did he mean by, "She deserves the truth"? Reilly, someone barked again. You good, man? I forced myself to step back from the car and nod. Yeah, I'm good. But I wasn't good. Not even close. When my shift finally ended, I sat in my truck outside the station with my forehead resting on the steering wheel. The sky was starting to lighten with hints of dawn, but I couldn't bring myself to start the engine. My brain felt like it was caught in a loop. Tell Alice I forgive her. Leela deserves the truth. It didn't make sense. Alice wasn't, she couldn't be involved in whatever this was. And Leela, she was just a kid. My kid. But why would a dying man say something like that? I pulled out my phone and stared at Alice's contact picture. Her smiling face stared back at me, the same smile she gave me when I'd walk through the door after a long shift. I hovered my thumb over the call button, but I couldn't do it. What was I even going to ask? Hey honey, do you know some guy who just died in a car wreck? Because his last words were about you and our daughter. No. I needed to see her face when I asked. When I walked through the front door of our house, the smell of coffee hit me first. Alice was standing in the kitchen, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, still wearing her robe. She turned and smiled. Hey, you're home early. Yeah, I said. My voice came out rough. She poured me a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. Rough shift. I picked up the mug but didn't drink. I just stared at her, searching her face for something, anything, that felt out of place. But she looked the same as always. Calm. Warm. Like home. Yeah. It was rough. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You okay? You look tired. I nodded and forced a smile. Just beat. I'm gonna shower. Okay, she said softly. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of our bed with my head in my hands. I wanted to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't. It was like a splinter in my brain. I barely spoke to Alice the next day. I couldn't stop replaying the accident in my head. The man's face. His voice. His words. Alice noticed, of course. She asked if something had happened at work, if I was okay, if I wanted to talk about it. I brushed her off every time. That night, after she and Leela went to bed, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at Alice's phone sitting on the counter. We had always been open with our phones. No passwords, no secrets. But it felt wrong. Still, I picked it up. I hesitated. Was I really about to do this? But the man's words came back to me, clear as day. Alice. Leela. The truth. I unlocked her phone and opened her messages. Nothing stood out. The usual texts from friends, school updates, reminders about groceries. I almost put it down. Almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. But then I saw a message thread at the bottom of the list. A number without a name. I clicked it. The messages were short. Some of them vague, others, not so much. I miss you. When can I see you again? Does he suspect anything? I stared at the screen, my hands starting to shake. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. This wasn't nothing. This was something. I scrolled up, looking for anything that could give me a name. But the messages only went back a couple of weeks. It wasn't enough. I put the phone back down, exactly where it had been, and leaned against the counter. My head was spinning. Was this connected to the men in the accident? Or was I losing my mind? I went upstairs and lay down next to Alice. She shifted in her sleep, her hand brushing against mine. I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the sound of her breathing and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I didn't sleep that night. I drove aimlessly until the sky turned pale and the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. At some point, I parked in an empty lot and just sat there, staring at the cracked asphalt. My chest felt tight, my head was pounding, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard that man's voice again. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet. The faint sound of cartoons came from the living room window, and the soft hum of the refrigerator buzzed through the silence as I stepped inside. Alice was in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug. She looked up when she saw me, her smile hesitant, her eyes scanning my face. She asked me where I'd been, if I was okay, why I hadn't called. I told her there had been an emergency at the station, something about a gas leak. It wasn't the best lie, but it was enough to get her to stop asking questions. Leela ran into the kitchen, her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, completely oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. I kissed her head and told her to have a good day at school. Alice watched me, her eyes lingering on my face longer than they should have. Once they were gone, the house felt hollow. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at Alice's phone charging on the counter. It wasn't there the night before. She must have brought it upstairs while I was out. For hours, I paced through the house. I'd stop by the window, watch cars drive by, then sit on the couch and stare at the blank TV screen. My thoughts were tangled, looping over and over around the same questions. Who was Michael Wade? How long had this been going on? And what did he mean by Leela deserves the truth? Eventually, I went to the garage and dug out an old laptop. Alice had a habit of syncing her email to our shared devices. It was supposed to be convenient, make life easier. I remembered that, and it was enough to push me over whatever edge of guilt was holding me back. I sat there, hands trembling on the keyboard, as her inbox loaded. It was all there. Conversations between her and him, stretching back years. Most of the emails were short, carefully worded, as if she'd been afraid of leaving too much behind. Plans to meet, vague excuses, shared secrets. But one email stood out. It was dated about 8 years ago, right before Leela was born. Alice had written about her pregnancy, about how scared she was, how unsure she felt. Michael responded, telling her that everything would be fine, that he would support her, but that she needed to make a choice, either tell me the truth or cut him out of her life. She'd made her choice. The words blurred together on the screen. My throat felt tight, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. Alice came home later in the afternoon with a bag of groceries. She walked into the kitchen and smiled at me, said I looked tired and that I should get some rest. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even meet her eyes. I just nodded and told her I was fine. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Leela came home from school, chattering about her art project. Alice made dinner, and we all sat together at the table. From the outside, we must have looked like a normal family, a husband, a wife, and their daughter. But every time Alice spoke, every time she laughed, every time her hand brushed against mine, all I could think about was the men in the car and the emails on that laptop. That night, after everyone was asleep, I went back to her phone. I had to know more. There weren't many new messages. Just one from Michael, "Is everything okay? You've been quiet." She hadn't responded yet. I stared at the screen for a long time before putting the phone back exactly where I found it. Then I sat in the living room in the dark, hands pressed against my face, trying to breathe, trying to think, trying to decide what the hell I was supposed to do next. The days that followed felt like an act. I went to work, came home, played with Leela, and avoided Alice's eyes. She noticed, of course. She asked if I was mad at her, if she'd done something wrong. She tried to kiss me one morning before I left for work, but I turned away. She froze for a second before stepping back. She said she'd see me later and went back to making Leela's breakfast. I didn't confront her. I couldn't. I wasn't ready. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, to force her to admit everything. But another part of me, the part that loved her, the part that still wanted to believe this was all some terrible mistake, kept holding me back. I started driving by Michael Wade's office. I found it easily enough. He owned a small marketing agency downtown, and his face was plastered across their website. He looked exactly how I imagined he would, polished, confident, smiling like he had the world figured out. One afternoon, I parked across the street from his office and watched people come and go through the glass doors. I wanted to storm in there, to confront him, to see the look on his face when he realized who I was. But I didn't. I sat there until the sun started to set, then drove home. At night, Alice started asking more questions. She said I was distant, that I wasn't acting like myself. She asked if something had happened at work. I told her I was just tired. But she wasn't stupid. She could tell something was wrong. The distance between us grew. Every conversation felt forced. Every glance felt heavy. I could feel her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes full of worry and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. The truth was right there, hanging between us like a heavy curtain, and sooner or later, one of us was going to pull it down. But I wasn't ready yet. I wasn't ready to hear her excuses, her apologies, or whatever lie she had prepared. And more than anything, I wasn't ready to let go of Leela. No matter what a piece of paper said, she was still my daughter. But Alice wasn't mine anymore. The days started blending together. Wake up, pretend everything was fine, go to work, come home, and sit through dinner like I wasn't choking on every word Alice said. Leela would tell me about her day, showing me her little drawings and school projects, and I'd smile and nod because she deserved that. She deserved my attention, even if my head was somewhere else entirely. Alice tried to close the gap between us. She'd touch my arm when she spoke, ask if I wanted to go out for dinner, suggest we watch one of those shows she loved on TV. But every gesture felt calculated now, every smile rehearsed. She must have sensed it, that I knew something. But she didn't push. She didn't ask the one question she was probably dying to know, do you know? I spent every quiet moment thinking about what I was going to do. Confronting her felt pointless. She'd either deny everything, cry, or give me some version of the truth that made her look like the victim. I wasn't interested in hearing her story. I already knew enough. I realized something important during those long, sleepless nights. Alice was not going to walk away from this untouched. She wasn't going to cry her way out of it or patch things up with a few carefully chosen words. No. She was going to feel this. She was going to understand what it felt like to have everything you love, everything you trust, ripped out from under you. But I couldn't let it explode. Not yet. I needed time to plan, to make sure every detail was in place. The first thing I did was visit a lawyer. I made an appointment with someone recommended by one of the guys at the station, a divorce attorney with a reputation for being ruthless. I told him everything, the affair, the DNA results, the emails. He sat there, nodding occasionally, jotting down notes in a leather-bound planner. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me I had options. Custody would be complicated since Leela wasn't biologically mine, but there were ways to fight for visitation rights. He said the courts often sided with the parent who had been the primary caregiver, regardless of blood. That was me. I was the one who had been there for her since day one. But I didn't just want visitation. I wanted Alice to lose. I wanted her to walk away from this with nothing but regret. The lawyer said that if I played my cards right, I could file first, secure temporary custody, and freeze our joint assets. Alice wouldn't see it coming. He handed me a list of things I needed to start collecting: bank statements, proof of infidelity, screenshots of messages, anything that could strengthen my case. I spent the next week gathering everything. I went through our shared bank accounts, documented every suspicious expense, and made copies of the emails I had found on her synced account. I made sure every detail was neatly organized in a folder labeled Legal Documents, and kept it locked in my toolbox in the garage. Alice noticed the change in me. She started watching me more closely, asking more questions. She wanted to know why I was so quiet, why I spent so much time out in the garage, why I wasn't sleeping next to her anymore. I told her work was stressful, that I was just tired, that I needed space. It wasn't entirely a lie. One evening, while she was out with some friends from work, I packed a bag with a few clothes and some of Leela's favorite toys. I left it in the trunk of my truck, ready to go at a moment's notice. The next part of the plan was trickier. I couldn't just leave without making sure Alice felt every ounce of what she had done to me. I needed her to believe, even if only for a moment, that she had won, that she had fooled me completely. I started acting normal again. I laughed at her jokes, kissed her cheek before heading to work, and even suggested we go out for dinner one night. She looked relieved, like she thought we had turned some invisible corner. It made me sick to see how easily she slipped back into pretending everything was fine. But that was the key to the plan, letting her believe the worst was over. In the meantime, I dug deeper into Michael Wade. I found out where he lived, what kind of car he drove, and even where he liked to grab his morning coffee. I didn't approach him. I didn't make a scene. But I wanted to know the face of the man who had taken a wrecking ball to my life. He was exactly what I expected, clean-cut, well-dressed, probably thought he was smarter than everyone around him. I wondered if he knew I was watching him. Probably not. Guys like him never think about the consequences until they're staring them in the face. I kept up the act at home. Alice started to relax. She stopped hovering, stopped questioning every little thing I did. That was when I knew it was time to set the final stage. I arranged for a friend from the station to help me move some things into storage. Furniture, valuables, anything I didn't want Alice getting her hands on when the hammer finally dropped. My friend didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any answers. A few days later, I made the call to my lawyer and told him it was time. He filed the papers immediately, setting things in motion before Alice even knew what was happening. That night, I sat across from her at dinner and listened to her talk about Leela's school recital, about how she wanted us to start planning a family vacation for the summer. She was smiling, laughing between bites of pasta, acting like she had nothing to hide. I let her talk. I let her feel comfortable. And when we cleared the plates, and she leaned over to kiss me, I kissed her back. It was the last time. The next morning, she woke up to find the house half empty and divorce papers waiting for her on the kitchen counter. I had packed up Leela and left before sunrise. The lawyer had already frozen our accounts, and Alice was locked out of everything except her personal savings. She called me over and over, but I didn't answer. She sent messages asking where I had taken Leela, why I was doing this, what was going on. But she knew. She must have known the moment she walked into that empty kitchen and saw the envelope with her name on it. It wasn't over yet. The court dates, the custody battles, the division of assets, it was all still ahead of us. But for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Alice was finally going to feel what it was like to lose everything. And I was going to make sure she felt every second of it. The days after I left Alice were harder than I expected. I had planned everything down to the smallest detail, but nothing could have prepared me for the silence that came after. Leela and I were staying in a small, temporary rental, a modest two-bedroom place about 20 minutes from her school. It wasn't home. The walls were bare, the furniture was basic, and the air always felt stale no matter how many windows I opened. Leela seemed confused but not scared. I tried to keep things normal for her. I packed her lunch every morning, helped her with homework in the evenings, and made sure she had her favorite stuffed bunny in bed every night. But kids notice things, even if they don't say them out loud. She asked about Alice sometimes, about when we'd go back home. I gave her the same answer every time, that things were complicated right now, but everything was going to be okay. It was hard to look her in the eyes when I said it. One night, Leela developed a fever. It started off mild, but by midnight, she was burning up. She was shaking, her forehead was drenched in sweat, and she kept calling for her mom in a soft, broken voice. I sat by her side, wiping her face with a damp cloth, trying not to let her see how worried I was. By 3 a.m, the fever wasn't going down, and I made the decision to take her to the hospital. I carried her out to the truck, wrapped in her favorite blanket, and drove through the empty streets with one eye on the rearview mirror. She was half asleep in the back seat, her small face pale under the streetlights. When we arrived, the ER was quiet except for the occasional beep of monitors and hushed voices behind the nurse's station. I signed us in, and they took Leela to a room right away. A nurse came in shortly after, a woman in her mid-30s with tired but kind eyes and dark blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her name tag said Olivia. She smiled at Leela, speaking to her softly while checking her temperature and listening to her breathing. She had a calm way about her, steady and focused, like she'd done this 1,000 times before. After a while, she looked up at me and said that it was likely just a viral infection, but they'd run a few tests to be sure. She assured me that Leela would be okay and suggested I grab some water from the vending machine while they monitored her for a bit. I didn't go far. I stood just outside the room, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed, staring at the floor. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A few minutes later, Olivia came out. She handed me a bottle of water without saying anything and leaned against the wall beside me. We stood there in silence for a while before she finally spoke. She said she'd been working night shifts for years now, ever since her husband passed away. Cancer, she said. They had 2 boys, both in middle school. She worked nights so she could be home with them during the day. She wasn't looking for sympathy when she said it, it felt more like she was just sharing a fact, filling the silence with something other than the sound of distant monitors and hushed conversations. I nodded and told her about Alice. I kept it simple. I said things had fallen apart, that I had taken Leela and left. I didn't go into details about Michael Wade or the DNA test. Olivia didn't press for more. She just listened, nodding occasionally, her expression steady. She told me it was going to be hard for a while. That kids are resilient, but they notice everything. She said the best thing I could do was show up for Leela every day, even on the days when it felt impossible. There was no pity in her voice, no empty words meant to make me feel better. Just honesty. After a while, she went back into the room to check on Leela again. I followed, sitting by Leela's bed and holding her hand while Olivia adjusted the monitors and made small notes on her chart. The test results came back normal. It was just a viral infection, like Olivia had suspected. They gave me some medication for the fever and told me to keep her hydrated and let her rest. By the time we left the hospital, the sky was starting to lighten, streaks of pale pink and orange creeping over the horizon. Leela was asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window. Over the next few days, Leela started to feel better. Her fever broke, her energy returned, and she was back to drawing pictures at the kitchen table and making little forts out of couch cushions. Alice had called a few times during those days. I didn't answer. I let the calls go to voicemail, and eventually, she stopped trying. My lawyer told me she'd been served the divorce papers and had contacted her own attorney. The process was officially in motion. Life settled into a strange rhythm after that. Work, school, dinner, bedtime. Repeat. I kept myself busy with tasks around the rental house, fixing little things that didn't need fixing, organizing drawers that were already neat. Anything to keep my mind from drifting back to Alice, to Michael Wade, to all the lies that had unraveled my life. But I didn't reach out to her. I didn't need a friend, and I definitely didn't need anything more than that. My focus was on Leela, on making sure she was okay, on making sure she still felt like she had a father she could count on. There was still so much ahead of me, custody hearings, meetings with lawyers, dividing everything Alice and I had built together. But for now, in that small rental house with my daughter sleeping soundly in the next room, it felt like the pieces were starting to settle. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. The divorce process with Alice had turned into exactly what I expected, cold, calculated, and exhausting. My lawyer and I had gone over every detail. I wasn't interested in playing fair. She had taken enough from me already, and I was going to make sure she walked away with as little as possible. Every asset, every shared account, every piece of property, we went through it all with a fine-tooth comb. Alice had made her choices, and now she was going to face the consequences. My lawyer said she was fighting hard, trying to play the victim, painting herself as someone who had just made a mistake and deserved forgiveness. But I wasn't buying it. I was calm in every meeting, every phone call, every exchange of emails. Alice had underestimated how far I was willing to go to make sure she didn't come out of this unscathed. Through it all, my focus stayed on Leela. She was the only thing that mattered. As long as I had her, I could deal with whatever mess Alice tried to throw at me. The weeks blurred together as the legal process dragged on, but I kept moving forward, one day at a time. I had my routine with Leela: school drop-offs, dinners, homework, bedtime stories. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable, and that was all I could ask for. Then came the fire. We got the call late one evening about a house fire on the edge of town. It was an older neighborhood, mostly modest homes packed close together. By the time we arrived, the upper floor was already engulfed in flames, thick black smoke pouring from the windows. We worked quickly, pulling hoses and checking for anyone trapped inside. The family, a mother and her 2 sons, had already made it out and were huddled together on the lawn. When I spotted the woman, I froze for a moment. It was Olivia. The same nurse who had helped Leela that night in the hospital. Her face was streaked with ash, her arms wrapped protectively around her boys. Once the fire was out, I walked over to her. She looked shaken but steady, her boys clinging to her sides. She explained that the fire had started in the kitchen, a grease fire that spread too quickly to control. They had nowhere to go. No nearby family, no friends who could take them in. Without thinking twice, I told her they could stay with me and Leela until she figured something out. By the time we got to my place, it was well past midnight. Leela had fallen asleep on the couch waiting for me to come home, her stuffed bunny clutched tightly in her arms. I carried her to her room while Olivia settled her boys on the pull-out couch in the living room. Over the next few days, Olivia and her sons became part of our lives. In the mornings, she helped me pack lunches while the kids sat at the table eating cereal. In the afternoons, they'd all sprawl across the living room floor with their homework and crayons. Evenings were spent making dinner together, arguing over what movie to watch, and trying to convince the kids that bedtime wasn't negotiable. It felt easy. Natural, even. At work, the guys started to notice. Mike asked me if I was sure there wasn't anything going on between me and Olivia. I laughed it off, told him I was just helping her out because it was the right thing to do. But he wasn't the only one asking questions. A few others made little comments, asking if I was starting to move on or if Olivia was more than just a guest. I shut it down every time. Nothing was happening. Olivia and I weren't crossing any lines. She was a good person who'd been dealt a bad hand, and I was just trying to help. But there were moments, small, quiet ones, that felt different. Sometimes, after the kids had gone to bed, Olivia and I would sit at the kitchen table, talking about our lives. She told me about her husband, about the 2 long years she spent by his side as cancer slowly took him away. She said she'd spent so much time trying to stay strong for her boys that she forgot what it felt like to let herself grieve. I told her about Alice. About how the betrayal had unfolded piece by piece until there was nothing left but anger and emptiness. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. She listened without interrupting, without offering empty sympathy. She just nodded, occasionally adding a quiet comment that showed she understood. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment. Just understanding. One Saturday, Olivia had to meet with her insurance adjuster, so I took all the kids to the park. The boys played soccer with some other kids while Leela climbed the jungle gym. Mike showed up with his son and spotted me sitting on a bench watching them. He didn't waste any time bringing up Olivia. He said it looked like more than just me helping out a friend, that I seemed different. Lighter, somehow. I told him there was nothing going on. Olivia was just staying with us until she got back on her feet. That was all. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed myself anymore. A few weeks later, Olivia's insurance came through. They'd found her a temporary rental house not far from where her old one had been. She told me one evening while the kids were watching cartoons. She said she'd be moving out by the weekend. I nodded and said that was good, that I was glad things were working out for her. But later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the couch staring at the empty pull-out where her boys had been sleeping. The house already felt quieter. When the day came, I helped Olivia pack up her things and load them into her car. The kids hugged each other goodbye, and Leela looked genuinely sad to see them go. Olivia thanked me for everything, for giving them a place to stay, for helping when they had no one else. I told her she didn't need to thank me. It felt like the right thing to do. When they drove away, I stood in the driveway with my hands in my pockets, staring at the empty spot where her car had been. The house felt different that night. Too quiet. Too still. Leela asked if the boys would come back to visit, and I told her they probably would. I hoped they would. But for now, it was just the two of us again. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. After Olivia and her boys moved out, the house felt emptier than ever. The days carried on like usual, school drop-offs, work shifts at the station, homework at the kitchen table, but the silence settled into the corners of every room. Leela noticed it too. She'd ask if we could invite the boys over to play or if we could go visit them. I told her we'd make plans soon, but the days kept slipping by without me following through. Thanksgiving crept up faster than I realized. One night, as Leela was coloring at the kitchen table, she asked if it would just be the two of us for the holiday. Her voice was quiet, and she wasn't looking up from her drawing. That question stuck with me. I knew she deserved better than a quiet dinner with just her dad at a half-empty table. The next morning, I sent a message to Olivia. I asked if she and the boys would like to come over for Thanksgiving. She responded quickly, saying they'd love to. When Thanksgiving arrived, I spent the morning cooking, well, as much as I could manage. I wasn't exactly a chef, but I had the basics covered: turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing from a box. Leela was excited, running around the house in her socks, asking when Olivia and the boys would arrive. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Leela ran to the door to greet them. The boys carried a couple of homemade pies Olivia had baked, and she walked in holding a dish covered in foil. Her smile was warm, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had ever changed. Dinner went better than I expected. The kids sat together at one end of the table, laughing and sneaking extra spoonfuls of mashed potatoes onto each other's plates. Olivia and I sat across from each other, talking about everything and nothing: how the kids were doing in school, how work had been, how fast time seemed to be moving. After dinner, the kids disappeared into Leela's room to play board games, and Olivia started clearing plates from the table. I joined her in the kitchen, rinsing dishes while she dried them. It felt easy, familiar, like we'd been doing it for years. At some point, one of the boys let out a loud yell from the other room, and we both froze for a second before laughing. I turned to say something to Olivia, and she was already looking at me. We were close, closer than we'd been in weeks. Neither of us said anything. We just stood there in the warm glow of the kitchen lights, the faint sound of kids arguing over board game rules in the background. Before I realized it, I leaned forward, and she met me halfway. It wasn't a dramatic kiss. It was soft, hesitant, like both of us were still trying to figure out if this was okay, if this was something we wanted to happen. We pulled away almost immediately, both of us looking a little startled. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, but one of the kids came running into the kitchen asking for snacks, and the moment passed. The rest of the evening went by quickly. The kids watched a movie on the couch while Olivia and I sat nearby, talking softly. When it was time for them to leave, Leela hugged the boys goodbye, and Olivia gave me a small, unsure smile as they walked out the door. That night, after Leela had gone to bed, I sat in the dark living room replaying the moment in the kitchen. I couldn't stop thinking about it, the way it felt, the way everything else faded away for those few seconds. The next morning, I sent Olivia a message asking if she'd consider moving in with us. I told her it didn't have to mean anything more than just sharing a home, making things easier for both of us. But we both knew there was more to it than that. She said yes. Within a week, Olivia and her boys moved back in. It felt different this time, less temporary, more settled. The kids were happy, Leela especially. The house was full again, not just with people but with laughter, warmth, and life. The legal battle with Alice continued in the background, but it started to feel less all-consuming. My lawyer kept me updated, and I made sure every document, every piece of evidence, was ready for court. Alice's lawyer pushed back hard, but the truth was on my side. When the final court date came, I sat in that stiff wooden chair and listened as the judge read the ruling. Custody was granted to me. Alice was given visitation rights, but they were limited and supervised. I walked out of that courthouse with a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was over. That night, we celebrated quietly at home. Olivia made dinner, the kids played in the living room, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally exhale. Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still challenges, still hard days, still moments where everything felt overwhelming. But there was also laughter at the dinner table, quiet conversations in the kitchen after the kids were asleep, and the simple comfort of knowing I wasn't carrying everything alone anymore. Leela started calling Olivia's boys her brothers. I'd catch her drawing little family portraits with all 5 of us, me, her, Olivia, and the boys. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, it had all felt endless when I was in the middle of it. But now, sitting in a warm house with people I cared about sleeping under the same roof, it felt like another life. If someone had told me back then that things would turn out like this, I wouldn't have believed them. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. It'll knock you down, it'll tear you apart, but you can get back up. You can rebuild. If you ever find yourself in a situation like mine, don't waste time trying to understand why someone betrayed you. Don't let them drag you down with their guilt, their excuses, their empty words. Focus on what matters. For me, that was Leela. And when you find something good, someone who stands by you without asking for anything in return, hold on to it. Because sometimes, even after the worst kind of betrayal, you can still find something worth holding on to.